How Spain became the first global superpower and lost it all. The birth of a global power. In the 16th century, a single nation transformed the world. Driven by faith, fire, and fortune, Spain forged the first true global empire in human history. Its galleons crossed oceans no one had dared master, carrying silver from the mountains of the Americas and spices from the islands of Asia. Spanish banners fluttered across 4 continents, from the silver plains of Bolivia to the islands of the Pacific, binding the world in an empire connected by wind, will, and war. For a time, it stood as an unstoppable force, rich beyond imagination, its armies unbeaten, its faith unshaken. But beneath that grandeur lay a tragic paradox. The same forces that lifted Spain to its dazzling heights would one day drag it into ruin. This is the story of how a kingdom born in the ashes of holy war built the first global superpower, and how the very wealth that crowned it in gold became the weight that sank it beneath the waves of history. Chapter 1. The Crucible of Faith and Fire. Spain's ascent began not with conquest abroad, but with centuries of struggle at home. For nearly 800 years, the Iberian Peninsula was divided, Christian and Muslim kingdoms locked in a relentless conflict known as the Reconquista. Since the year 711, Muslim forces had ruled vast stretches of the south, forming a prosperous civilization called Al-Andalus, famed for its architecture, philosophy, and science. To the north, Christian realms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Leon, waged a holy war to reclaim their land. This grinding conflict shaped Spain's national character. It fused faith and warfare into a single purpose, to fight not just for survival, but for divine destiny. By the late 15th century, that destiny was about to be realized. In 1469, a union changed everything. The marriage of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon bound 2 great kingdoms together under one crown. United, they shared a vision of a Christian Spain, powerful, pure, and absolute in faith. Their partnership was ruthless and efficient. They centralized power, reformed the army, and set their sights on the last Muslim stronghold, Granada. The war for Granada raged for 11 years. Siege followed siege, city after city fell, and on January 2nd, 1492, the banners of Castile and Aragon were raised over the Alhambra. The Reconquista, a struggle that had lasted almost 8 centuries, was complete. Spain was reborn. That same year, in the flush of triumph, Isabella and Ferdinand took 2 fateful steps that would shape the nation's soul for centuries. The first was the Alhambra Decree, expelling all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity. The second was their approval of a bold proposal by a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus, who claimed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. Few could have imagined it, but both decisions, one born of zeal, the other of ambition, would echo across continents. One would close the door on Spain's past, the other would fling open the gates to its imperial future. And so, with faith burning bright and the winds of history shifting, Spain stood on the threshold of a new world. If you love deep dives into history like this, subscribe and ring the bell. Join us on Lazarus Logic History as we explore how the empires that shaped our world rose and fell. Chapter 2. The Gamble that Changed the World. The year 1492 was not only the end of an old war, it was the dawn of a new world. With Granada conquered and Spain united under the cross, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand stood as Europe's rising power. But victory on the battlefield had left them with restless soldiers, ambitious nobles, and an appetite for something greater. The peninsula was theirs. Now, their gaze turned toward the horizon. Into this moment of ambition walked a man with a map and a dream. Christopher Columbus, a determined navigator from Genoa, believed he could reach the rich markets of Asia by sailing west across the uncharted Atlantic. To most of Europe, his proposal was madness. No one knew how far the ocean stretched, and many thought his tiny ships would vanish into oblivion. But Isabella saw something different. Perhaps it was divine providence, or perhaps the thrill of a new crusade. Whatever it was, she agreed to fund the voyage. Her gamble would change the course of history. On the 3rd of August, 1492, Columbus departed from Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. 2 months later, just before dawn on October 12th, a lookout spotted land. Columbus believed he had reached the fringes of Asia. In truth, he had stumbled upon the Caribbean, the gateway to 2 vast continents unknown to Europe. At first, what he found seemed modest: islands covered in forests, gentle people, and traces of gold. But to the Spanish crown, that glimmer was enough. Soon, more expeditions followed, and with them came soldiers, settlers, and the heavy hand of conquest. Spain's foothold began on the islands of Hispaniola and Cuba, where the encomienda system was born, a regime granting Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities in exchange for labor and tribute. It was exploitation dressed as evangelism. The Taíno and other native peoples suffered under forced labor, disease, and cultural destruction. Still, the gold from these islands was only a whisper of what was to come. The conquistadors who followed Columbus, men hardened by war and driven by faith and greed, believed they stood at the edge of Eden. Stories began to circulate of kingdoms rich with silver, temples lined with gold, and empires greater than any in Europe. The Spanish crown saw opportunity in every rumor. In 1519, a young and fiercely ambitious soldier named Hernán Cortés sailed from Cuba toward the coast of Mexico, against the direct orders of his governor. He carried with him not just weapons and men, but a conviction that destiny was on Spain's side. From that moment, conquest became not merely exploration, but a divine mission: to expand Christendom, to gather wealth for the crown, and to prove that Spain's triumph over the Moors had been only the beginning. Within a generation, the ripples from Columbus's voyage would become a tidal wave of empire. The Spanish would bring down civilizations, drain mountains of their silver, and reshape the global economy itself. But every empire begins with a moment of chance, and for Spain, that chance began with 3 small ships and a queen's dangerous faith. Chapter 3: The Fall of the Aztecs. By 1519, Spain's ambitions had outgrown the Caribbean. The islands had been conquered, the native populations devastated, and the streams of gold disappointingly small. But on the horizon lay whispers of a land so rich it defied imagination. A realm of towering temples, thriving cities, and rulers adorned in gold. To the conquistadors, it sounded like destiny calling. Among them was a man whose name would be etched forever into the story of empire: Hernán Cortés. Born in Medellín, Extremadura, Cortés was a restless soldier, intelligent, daring, and utterly ruthless. Against the orders of his governor in Cuba, he assembled a force of about 600 men, a handful of cannon, and 16 horses. His goal: the Great Mainland. In February 1519, his ships reached the coast of Mexico. There he made contact with local peoples long oppressed by the Aztec Empire, a mighty civilization centered in the Valley of Mexico. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a vision: grand causeways, glittering temples, and markets bursting with life. It was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities on Earth, home to perhaps 200,000 people, larger than most European capitals of the time. Cortés quickly realized that to defeat such a power, he couldn't rely on force alone. He would need strategy. and allies. With cunning diplomacy, he formed pacts with indigenous nations like the Tlaxcalans, who saw the Spanish as a means to break free from Aztec domination. As he marched inland, Cortés used a blend of deception, religious awe, and superior weaponry to unsettle his foes. The Spanish steel, horses, and gunpowder were unlike anything the Aztecs had ever encountered. When Cortés finally reached Tenochtitlan, he was welcomed as a guest by Emperor Moctezuma II, who, according to some accounts, believed the strangers might be divine envoys. But reverence soon turned to betrayal. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage, holding him within his own palace while Spanish forces looted the city's treasures. Tension erupted into violence, and the fragile peace collapsed. The Spanish were driven out in a desperate retreat remembered as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, where hundreds of conquistadors and their allies were killed as they fled through the causeways, burdened by the gold they tried to carry away. Yet Cortés refused to accept defeat. He regrouped, rallied his native allies, and returned the following year. This time, he brought with him something far deadlier than any weapon: smallpox, carried unknowingly by one of his men. The epidemic ravaged Tenochtitlan, killing tens of thousands, including many of its leaders. In August 1521, after a brutal siege that lasted months, the once mighty city fell. Tenochtitlan was reduced to ashes and corpses. Its temples were torn down, its canals filled in, and over its ruins rose a new city, Mexico City, the jewel of Spain's growing empire in the New World. The conquest of the Aztec Empire sent shockwaves through Europe. Spain had achieved the impossible. With just a few hundred men, it had toppled one of the world's great civilizations. Gold and silver began to flow across the Atlantic, feeding an empire that was only just awakening to its power. But Spain's hunger was far from satisfied. South, beyond the jungles and mountains, lay rumors of another empire, one even richer, even larger. And soon, another Spanish conquistador would follow those whispers into history. Chapter 4: The Conquest of the Inca Empire. A decade after the fall of Tenochtitlan, Spain's empire stretched across the Caribbean and deep into Central America. Yet, for all its conquests, the greatest treasure still lay undiscovered, far to the south, beyond dense jungles and towering mountains. There, high in the Andes, thrived the Inca Empire, the largest realm in the pre-Columbian world. Its roads stretched for thousands of miles across mountains and valleys. Its cities, built from massive stone blocks fitted so precisely that not even a knife's edge could pass between them, stood as testaments to engineering genius. The Inca ruled over millions, commanding an empire rich in gold, silver, and labor. To the Spanish, it was a realm of unimaginable wealth, a second Tenochtitlan waiting to be taken. In 1532, a veteran conquistador named Francisco Pizarro led an expedition of fewer than 200 men from Panama into the heart of the Andes. Like Cortés, he was driven by greed, faith, and an unshakable belief in divine destiny. The odds were absurd, a few hundred adventurers against an empire of millions. But the Spanish had a weapon the Inca could not match: timing. The empire Pizarro marched into was already weakened. A devastating civil war had just ended between two royal brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, both claiming the throne after their father's death. Atahualpa had emerged victorious, but his empire was fractured and vulnerable. In November 1532, Pizarro met Atahualpa in the mountain town of Cajamarca. The meeting was a carefully laid trap. The Spanish invited the emperor to parley, promising peace. When Atahualpa arrived with thousands of unarmed attendants, Pizarro's men ambushed them. Cannons roared, muskets fired, and chaos erupted. Within hours, the Inca army was shattered. thousands killed, and the emperor himself taken captive. Atahualpa, stunned by the attack, sought to ransom his life. He promised to fill a room once with gold and twice with silver, enough to cover the walls from floor to ceiling. For months, treasure poured in, idols, jewelry, sacred vessels, all melted into bars for shipment to Spain. By some estimates, the ransom was worth over £13,000 of gold and £26,000 of silver, the largest ransom ever paid in human history. But when the room was full, Pizarro broke his promise. Atahualpa was executed, strangled after a mock trial. The empire, leaderless and demoralized, collapsed. Within a year, the Spanish captured Cusco, the Inca capital, and the once mighty empire of the Andes was gone. From that conquest, Spain gained control of the greatest sources of precious metal the world had ever known, especially the Potosi silver mines in modern-day Bolivia. The mountain there, known as Cerro Rico, the rich hill, would become the beating heart of Spain's global wealth. For more than 2 centuries, galleons loaded with silver from Potosi and Zacatecas in Mexico crossed the Atlantic in vast treasure fleets. It is estimated that between the 16th and 18th centuries, the Spanish Empire extracted over 150,000 tons of silver, nearly 80% of the world's supply at the time. That torrent of wealth transformed Spain into the richest nation in Europe. Its kings commanded armies that shaped the destiny of continents. Its palaces glittered with gold, its artists painted masterpieces, and its fleets ruled the seas. But beneath that glittering surface, something dangerous was beginning to stir. An invisible poison that would slowly corrode the empire from within. Chapter 5. The Silver Empire, Spain's Golden Age. By the mid-16th century, Spain stood astride the world like a colossus. Its banners flew from the Americas to Asia, from the Caribbean to the coasts of Africa. Silver from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas poured into its ports in staggering quantities. Every year, fleets of galleons, vast lumbering fortresses of oak and iron, crossed the Atlantic in glittering convoys, escorted by warships bristling with cannon. In Europe, this river of treasure made Spain the envy and terror of its rivals. King Charles V, and later his son Philip II, ruled an empire so vast that its territories encircled the globe. Spanish silver paid the wages of mercenaries from Flanders to Italy, financed grand cathedrals, and bought alliances that reshaped European politics. For a time, it seemed that nothing lay beyond Spain's reach. At home, the wealth of empire ushered in what historians call the Siglo de Oro, the Spanish Golden Age. Artists like El Greco and Velázquez filled royal courts with masterpieces that captured both grandeur and melancholy. Writers such as Cervantes chronicled the contradictions of Spanish identity, a nation of dreamers and warriors, proud yet haunted by its ideals. Architecture soared, theatres flourished, and scholars debated faith, empire, and destiny. The Spanish army, the legendary tercios, became Europe's most feared fighting force. Formed from the veterans of the Reconquista and the New World, these disciplined soldiers revolutionized warfare with their combination of pikes, muskets, and unbreakable formations. They crushed the armies of France and the Holy Roman Empire, defended Catholicism across Europe, and enforced Spain's will with ruthless precision. And yet, even at its zenith, the empire's brilliance concealed its fragility. The silver that seemed to promise endless prosperity was quietly undermining the foundations of Spain's economy. The massive influx of bullion flooded European markets, driving prices ever higher. Bread, cloth, and tools became expensive luxuries, while wages stagnated. The phenomenon would later be known as the price revolution, a continent-wide inflation that eroded Spain's wealth, even as its treasure fleets grew. Silver made the crown rich, but it also made Spain dependent. Why manufacture when everything could be imported? Why cultivate when foreign merchants would deliver goods to your doorstep in exchange for a single ingot? Spanish industry withered. The fields emptied. The nation became a consumer of the wealth it extracted, rather than a producer of its own prosperity. Meanwhile, the monarchy's ambitions multiplied. Charles V and Philip II saw themselves not merely as kings, but as defenders of the one true faith, champions of Catholicism in an age torn apart by the Protestant Reformation. Wars flared across the Netherlands, Germany, and the Mediterranean. Vast sums of silver funded crusades against heresy, rebellion, and rival powers. By the late 1500s, Spain was spending more on war than it earned from all its colonies combined. Despite its rivers of silver, the crown was perpetually in debt, borrowing heavily from Italian and German bankers. Philip II would declare bankruptcy 4 times during his reign. The empire's wealth was real, but its stability was an illusion, a glittering facade masking growing cracks. Still, for the world watching from beyond its borders, Spain appeared unassailable. Its fleets ruled the seas, its soldiers ruled the continent, and its faith ruled the hearts of its people. The empire seemed eternal, but even the brightest dawn carries the shadow of its own decline, and Spain's would come not from invasion, but from within. Chapter 6. The Golden Cage. By the dawn of the 17th century, Spain ruled more territory than any power in history. From the icy waters of the North Atlantic to the humid jungles of the Philippines, the empire stretched across time zones, languages, and faiths. To outsiders, it appeared invincible, a Christian colossus ordained by God. But beneath the surface, the machinery of empire was grinding itself apart. Spain's greatest asset, silver, had become its deadliest weakness. The endless flow of bullion from the New World created an illusion of eternal wealth. The crown could buy anything: armies, ships, influence. But what it couldn't buy was sustainability. Silver was not industry, it was not innovation. It was wealth that corroded as quickly as it gleamed. The price revolution that had begun decades earlier now engulfed Europe. The sheer volume of precious metal in circulation sent prices soaring. Basic goods, bread, wool, tools, tripled in cost. The value of money plummeted. Spain's royal treasury, flooded with silver, found itself paradoxically poorer each year because its income was worth less than its expenses. Inflation hollowed out the economy from within. Meanwhile, the empire's aristocracy, accustomed to easy wealth, abandoned trade and craftsmanship. Labor and manufacturing were considered beneath the dignity of the nobility. Instead of investing in production, Spain imported nearly everything: timber from the Baltic, ships from Italy, weapons from Flanders, even food from France. The nation that ruled the world had stopped feeding itself. Foreign merchants grew rich selling to Spain, their ships leaving Iberian ports heavy with silver and returning with goods Spain could have made itself. The empire became a paradox, the richest kingdom on earth, dependent on its rivals to survive. At the same time, Spain's political ideology chained it to perpetual war. Kings Charles V and Philip II had convinced themselves that their divine mission was to defend Catholicism everywhere it was challenged. That mission meant endless fronts: Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, French armies on the Pyrenean border, Ottoman fleets in the Mediterranean, and English privateers prowling the seas. The most devastating of these was the 80 Years' War, a conflict that drained Spanish coffers and exhausted its legendary tercios. Each campaign cost millions in wages, supplies, and ships, all funded by loans mortgaged against the next shipment of silver from the Americas. The debt spiraled until even the silver fleets could no longer keep pace. In 1557, Spain defaulted for the first time. it would not be the last. Over the next century, the crown declared bankruptcy no fewer than 13 times. Each collapse crippled its credit, forcing it to borrow at ruinous rates. The empire was now trapped, sustained only by the very wealth that was destroying it, a golden cage. Meanwhile, enemies grew bolder. The Dutch, fueled by trade and innovation, built a commercial empire from rebellion. The English turned piracy into national policy, seizing Spanish treasure ships on the open seas. Every chest of silver became a target, every voyage a gamble. And yet, Spain pressed on. Its leaders believed that to retreat would be to defy God himself. Faith, pride, and inertia bound the empire to a path it could no longer afford to walk. Still, for all its problems, Spain's power was far from broken. Its navy was vast, its armies undefeated, and its colonies still overflowing with wealth. The illusion of strength endured, but illusions can be deadly, especially when the truth is hidden beneath gold. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the world's first global superpower, hit the like button. It helps more history lovers discover these untold stories. And soon, Spain would learn how fragile its empire truly was, when it faced the sea and found that even its might could be shattered by wind and storm. Chapter 7. The Armada and the Shattered Illusion. By the late 1580s, King Philip II of Spain ruled the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. His dominions stretched from the Americas to Asia, his armies dominated Europe, and his fleets commanded the seas. Yet behind this splendor, his enemies multiplied: Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, restless subjects at home and across the Channel, a new rival rising to challenge him: England. For years, English ships had raided Spanish treasure fleets, stealing gold and silver bound for Seville. Privateers like Sir Francis Drake, celebrated in London and cursed in Madrid, attacked Spanish ports across the Atlantic. Worse still, England's Queen Elizabeth I openly supported the Dutch rebellion, funneling money and soldiers into Philip's own backyard. To Philip, a devout Catholic, it was not only a political affront, it was heresy. In his mind, God himself had chosen him to defend the true faith, and so in 1588 he ordered what he called the Enterprise of England, a holy war to overthrow Elizabeth, restore Catholicism, and end English interference once and for all. What followed would become one of the most famous naval campaigns in history. Philip assembled an enormous invasion fleet, 130 ships, 30,000 men, and enough supplies for half a year at sea. It was called the Armada, and its mission was to escort an army of 30,000 from the Spanish Netherlands to England's shores. In theory, it was unstoppable. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare. When the Armada set sail from Lisbon in May 1588, its ranks included galleons, troop transports, and fireships, all under the command of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a nobleman of high birth but little naval experience. The English fleet that awaited them was smaller but faster, led by veterans like Drake and Lord Charles Howard of Effingham, who knew the treacherous winds of the Channel better than anyone alive. The fleets met off the coast of Cornwall and fought a running series of skirmishes up the English Channel. The Spanish ships, built for boarding and close combat, struggled to close distance. The English, with their long-range cannon and superior maneuverability, battered them from afar, darting in and out like wolves around a wounded bull. By late July, the Armada anchored near Calais, hoping to rendezvous with the invasion army waiting in the Netherlands. But the weather, always the silent general, turned against them. The English launched fireships into the harbour, setting the night ablaze. Panic erupted. The tightly packed Spanish formation scattered to avoid the inferno, breaking its own defensive line. At dawn, the English struck. The Battle of Gravelines raged for hours as cannon thundered and smoke choked the sky. When the fighting ended, the Armada was crippled. The winds then finished what the English guns had begun. Forced to retreat north around Scotland and Ireland, the fleet was ravaged by storms. Dozens of ships were smashed against the rocks. Thousands of sailors perished. When the survivors limped home, Philip refused to see them. He is said to have murmured, "I sent my ships to fight men, not the elements." Though Spain remained powerful, the defeat shattered the illusion of its invincibility. Across Europe, its enemies rejoiced. In London, bells rang for days. In Amsterdam, Dutch rebels took heart. If England could wound the giant, so could they. The loss of the Armada marked a turning tide. Spain's empire was still immense, its armies still formidable, but its aura of divine destiny had cracked. From now on, it would face challenges on every front, and no amount of silver could restore what pride had lost. Chapter 8. The War of 100 Fronts. The defeat of the Armada in 1588 was not the end of Spain's greatness, but it was the beginning of its exhaustion. The empire still spanned oceans, its silver fleet still sailed, and its armies still terrified Europe. Yet one truth now haunted Madrid. For all its power, Spain could no longer fight everywhere at once. The 80 Years' War in the Netherlands had already bled the empire dry. Since 1568, Protestant rebels had fought for independence from Spanish rule. At first, the tercios crushed them with ruthless precision, veterans of Italy and the Americas, their discipline legendary. But the war dragged on, draining treasure and morale alike. The Dutch, rich from trade and fortified by faith, refused to yield. As decades passed, the rebellion evolved into something more, a revolution of ideas. The Dutch built a new kind of state, powered not by kings or crusades, but by commerce and invention. They financed their wars through trade, developed advanced banking systems, and built fleets of agile merchant ships that would one day rule the seas. In fighting to suppress them, Spain had unwittingly helped to create its own rival. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, Philip II and his successors found themselves locked in endless conflict. Against France, Spain waged costly wars for influence over Italy and the Pyrenees. Against the Ottoman Empire, it fought to control the Mediterranean. In Germany, Spain intervened in the 30 Years' War, trying to crush Protestantism once and for all. Every campaign demanded silver, mountains of it, and every mountain had to be mined, minted, guarded, and shipped across thousands of miles of dangerous ocean. The more Spain fought, the more it depended on the New World. The more it depended, the more fragile it became. By the early 1600s, cracks had deepened into chasms. Inflation continued to rise, the treasury groaned under impossible debts, and royal taxes pushed peasants to starvation. When Philip III and Philip IV inherited the throne, they faced an empire staggering under its own weight. At home, discontent simmered. Revolts broke out in Catalonia and Naples, and in 1640, Portugal, Spain's neighbour and longtime partner, seized its chance. After 60 years of uneasy union under Spanish rule, Portugal declared independence. Spain, too overstretched to respond effectively, was forced to let it go. The empire that had once dominated half the world was now losing ground in its own backyard. Abroad, the Dutch war dragged toward its grim conclusion. After 80 long years of fighting, Spain finally recognized Dutch independence in the Treaty of Münster in 1648, a humiliating end to a century of struggle. At sea, a new generation of rivals rose to challenge Spain's dominance. The English and the Dutch built global trade empires that outpaced Spain's rigid colonial model. They traded freely, invested shrewdly, and armed their merchants like warships. Spain's own fleets, once unstoppable, became lumbering relics of a bygone age. Even the lifeblood of empire, the silver fleets, faced growing danger. Pirates, privateers, and enemy navies prowled the Atlantic, preying on the treasure convoys. Each lost ship meant lost pay for soldiers, lost interest for bankers, lost stability for the crown. By the mid-17th century, Spain was a superpower in name only. It still possessed vast territories, but its influence was fading. Its rivals had learned its secrets, how to build wealth from trade instead of plunder, and how to wield commerce as effectively as cannon. Yet, in Madrid, kings still spoke of divine destiny and eternal glory. Pride would not allow the empire to admit its decline, and so Spain marched on, weary but unyielding, a warrior too proud to lay down its sword. But every war leaves scars, and Spain's were spreading across its body like cracks through stone. The Golden Age was ending, and soon even its kings would realize that no empire, no matter how vast, can fight forever. Chapter 9. The Waning Sun. By the late 1600s, the Spanish Empire was still enormous. Its territories spanned continents. Its flag still flew from Manila to Mexico. But the light that had once dazzled the world was dimming. The empire that had conquered 2 hemispheres now struggled to control itself. After a century of ceaseless war, the treasury was drained, the people exhausted, and the spirit of conquest replaced by a heavy, suffocating stagnation. The mines of the New World still produced silver, but the easy riches of the early days were gone. The richest veins at Potosi and Zacatecas were exhausted, forcing miners ever deeper underground. Production slowed, costs soared, and the once unstoppable flow of wealth began to dry up. Without silver, Spain's economic foundation crumbled. The empire had built its strength not on trade or industry, but on extraction, the relentless pulling of treasure from conquered lands. Now, with that treasure waning, its weaknesses were laid bare. Factories lay idle, fields untended, and merchants ruined by imported goods. Foreign traders, especially the Dutch and English, dominated Spanish ports, profiting where Spain could not. The monarchy, once led by giants like Charles V and Philip II, now passed into the hands of weaker men. Philip III, Philip IV, and Charles II, the last of the Habsburg line, were rulers born to crowns but not to leadership. The machinery of empire continued to turn, but without direction or reform. Corruption seeped through every level of government. Nobles sought wealth through royal favour instead of innovation. Priests wielded more power than ministers. Bureaucrats stifled change beneath layers of tradition. Spain had become a ghost of its former self, magnificent in memory, brittle in reality. In Europe, new powers rose to take its place. France under Louis XIV became the dominant force on the continent. The French army, once humbled by Spain's tercios, now outnumbered and outmatched them. French culture replaced Spanish as the language of diplomacy and refinement. Across the Channel, England, once a rebellious island kingdom, grew rich through trade, colonization, and the first stirrings of empire. Spain still clung to its global possessions, the Americas, the Philippines, and scattered enclaves in Africa and Asia, but its control was slipping. Colonial officials grew independent, merchants ignored Madrid's decrees, and piracy flourished in the Caribbean. The empire was simply too vast to govern effectively with the slow communication and rigid systems of the age. The final years of the 17th century brought an even deeper blow. When Charles II died in 1700 without an heir, Europe trembled. His death sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict over who would inherit the empire's enormous territories. France backed Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, while England, the Netherlands, and Austria united to prevent the crowns of Spain and France from merging. For over a decade, Europe burned. Battles raged from Flanders to Italy, and Spain itself became a battlefield once more. When the war finally ended in 1714, Spain had lost much of its European influence. The Treaty of Utrecht stripped it of its territories in Italy and the Low Countries, the jewels of its continental empire. Though a new dynasty, the Bourbons, now ruled from Madrid, the empire they inherited was a shadow of its former self. Spain remained vast, but its power was brittle, a memory of greatness living on borrowed time. Still, pride endured. The Spanish believed their empire eternal, ordained by God, but the sun that once illuminated the world from Iberia's shores was sinking lower each year. And soon, new revolutions, born not in Europe but across the Atlantic, would bring the empire to its knees. Chapter 10. The Empire in Revolt. By the dawn of the 19th century, Spain's once glorious empire was an empire in name only. The Bourbon kings who had succeeded the Habsburgs had tried to modernize the decaying state, reforming administration, tightening control over the colonies, and introducing Enlightenment ideas into a system still chained to the past. For a brief moment, there was hope. Trade expanded, shipyards revived, and silver production flickered back to life. But Spain's reforms came too late, and history was about to sweep them away. In 1808, a storm rolled out of France, and its name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Having conquered most of Europe, the French emperor turned his attention to Iberia. Spain, weakened by corruption and indecision, was an easy target. Napoleon's troops crossed the Pyrenees, seized Madrid, and forced King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII to abdicate. In their place, he installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as king. For the Spanish people, this was humiliation beyond endurance. Overnight, their homeland became a battlefield. Peasants, priests, and soldiers alike rose up in furious resistance. What followed was the Peninsular War, a brutal, grinding conflict that would define modern guerrilla warfare. Bands of irregular fighters known as guerrilleros ambushed French columns, sabotaged supplies, and vanished into the mountains. Cities like Zaragoza and Girona became symbols of defiance. Spain's fields burned, its towns starved, and its churches were sacked. Yet the invasion also fractured the empire far beyond Europe's shores. Across the Atlantic, in Spain's vast American colonies, a political crisis erupted. For centuries, colonial rule had depended on the authority of the Spanish crown, and suddenly that crown was gone. With the king deposed and a French puppet on the throne, local elites, known as criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, began to question their allegiance. They had long resented the peninsulares, the officials sent from Spain who monopolized the highest offices and treated the colonies as sources of revenue, not as partners. Now, with Spain in chaos, the criollos saw their chance. Across Latin America, local governing councils, or juntas, were formed, first claiming loyalty to the absent King Ferdinand, but in truth laying the foundations for independence. In Venezuela, Colombia, and Mexico, these juntas gradually transformed into revolutionary movements. The ideas of liberty and self-rule, once whispered in secret, now rang from church pulpits and public squares. The same Enlightenment ideals that had shaken Europe now inflamed the New World. When Napoleon finally fell in 1815 and Ferdinand VII was restored to the throne, he made a fatal mistake. Instead of embracing reform and granting limited autonomy to his colonies, he returned to absolutism, determined to reimpose Spain's full control. But the colonies had tasted freedom, and there was no going back. From 1810 to 1825, the Americas erupted in wars of independence. Leaders such as Simón Bolívar, El Libertador, and José de San Martín became legends, uniting armies of freed slaves, indigenous peoples, and patriots under the banner of liberation. Bolívar freed northern South America, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia, while San Martin crossed the Andes to liberate Chile and Peru. By 1825, the empire that had once ruled half the world had lost nearly all of its mainland American colonies. Only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines remained, isolated outposts of a fading dominion. The sun had not yet set completely, but its light was weak and distant. Spain's empire, once the engine of global power, was now little more than a memory of conquest and a handful of dying embers scattered across the oceans. Chapter 11: The Last Embers of Empire. By the mid-19th century, the once mighty Spanish Empire had been reduced to fragments, isolated islands of red on the world map. The vast dominions of the New World were gone, and with them the silver that had once filled Spain's coffers. What remained were Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, the final jewels in a tarnished crown. Spain, now a diminished kingdom, struggled to find its place in a modern, industrializing world. Europe had changed beyond recognition. Britain, France, and the rising power of the United States had built global empires driven by trade, technology, and steam, while Spain, still haunted by its past glories, clung to its colonial relics as proof of its former greatness. The 19th century was not kind to the mother country. The political chaos unleashed by the Napoleonic invasion never truly ended. Civil wars, royal coups, and shifting constitutions tore through Spain like storms. Between 1808 and 1874, the nation cycled through monarchies, republics, and dictatorships in dizzying succession. Each new government promised reform, and each failed to deliver it. Meanwhile, the colonies that remained grew restless. In Cuba, Spain's most valuable possession, sugar plantations brought immense wealth, but also immense inequality. By the 1860s, Cuban landowners and revolutionaries alike demanded greater autonomy. When Madrid refused, rebellion broke out in what became known as the 10 Years' War, 1868 to 1878. It was a brutal, grinding conflict that left the island devastated. Though Spain ultimately retained control, it was victory in name only. The rebellion had lit a fire that would never go out. 2 decades later, in 1895, Cuba rose again. This time, the cry for freedom could not be silenced. Leaders like José Martí, poet, philosopher, and martyr, rallied a new generation under the banner of Patria o Muerte, fatherland or death. Guerrilla warfare swept the countryside, Spanish troops resorted to harsh counterinsurgency tactics, and atrocities mounted on both sides. Across the ocean, the world watched. The newly ascendant United States, with its own imperial ambitions, viewed the chaos in Cuba as both a humanitarian crisis and an opportunity. American newspapers practicing yellow journalism fanned public outrage with sensational stories of Spanish brutality, some true, many exaggerated. Then, on February 15, 1898, an explosion ripped through the harbour of Havana. The US battleship USS Maine sank beneath the waves, killing over 250 sailors. The cause was unclear, but the headlines were decisive. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Within weeks, the Spanish-American War began. It was short, swift, and devastating. Spain's navy, once the terror of the seas, was hopelessly outdated, its ships slower and its guns weaker than America's modern steel fleet. At the Battle of Manila Bay, Commodore George Dewey annihilated the entire Spanish Pacific Squadron in a single morning. In the Caribbean, American forces invaded Cuba and Puerto Rico, overwhelming Spanish garrisons that fought with courage but little hope. After just 3 months, it was over. The Treaty of Paris, 1898, forced Spain to surrender its last colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, to the United States. 4 centuries of global dominion ended with the stroke of a pen. In Madrid, mourning was mixed with disbelief. For generations, Spain had imagined itself as chosen by God, destined to rule. Now, that illusion was gone. The empire that had once reshaped the world was gone, leaving behind only language, faith, and memory. Spain entered the 20th century not as a conqueror, but as a survivor, a humbled nation, standing amid the ashes of its former glory. Chapter 12. Legacy of Empire. When the guns of 1898 fell silent, Spain stood at the edge of a new century. No longer an empire, but a nation haunted by memory. For the first time in 400 years, the world beyond its shores no longer belonged to Madrid. The red of empire had faded from the maps, replaced by new powers, Britain, France, and the United States. But the echo of Spain's dominion had not vanished. It lived on, woven into the languages, faiths, and cultures of half the planet. The Spanish Empire had begun with a prayer and a gamble, a marriage that united kingdoms, a voyage across an unknown ocean, and a belief that conquest was divine destiny. It had given the world explorers, artists, soldiers, saints, and scholars. It had also left a legacy of violence, oppression, and exploitation that shaped centuries of history. Yet history's truth is rarely simple. From conquest and conflict emerged something enduring, a shared cultural world that spans from Seville to Santiago, from Manila to Mexico City. Today, over 500 million people speak Spanish as their native tongue. The Catholic faith, carried by missionaries and monarchs, became one of the defining pillars of Latin America. The music, food, architecture, and art born from the fusion of indigenous, European, and African traditions form a living mosaic of human exchange. Spain's fall was slow, but its influence is eternal. Its voyages connected continents for the first time, creating the framework of global trade, communication, and cultural exchange that defines the modern world. The Manila galleons linked Asia to the Americas. The silver from Potosi funded Europe's transformation. The ideas born from empire, both noble and cruel, reshaped how humanity saw itself. And yet, the empire's story is also a warning. Spain's greatness was built on a single pillar: wealth without sustainability. The mountains of silver that made it rich also made it complacent. The wars fought for faith and glory left it isolated. The rigid belief in divine purpose blinded it to the forces of change sweeping across the world. When innovation replaced conquest, Spain could not adapt. Its empire collapsed not in a single moment but over centuries, eroded by its own contradictions. Still, the empire's ashes nurtured new worlds. The nations that emerged from its ruins forged their own identities, carrying forward fragments of what Spain had built: language, art, architecture, and spirit, reimagined for their own futures. The conquistadors' dreams of eternity found a different kind of immortality, not in territory or thrones, but in culture, words, and memory. In that sense, Spain did not simply fall, it transformed. The same forces that tore down its empire helped give birth to a global civilization united by language, story, and faith. For Spain itself, the loss of empire was painful but purifying. Out of defeat came reflection. In the decades that followed, it turned inward, seeking meaning not in conquest, but in creativity, in art, philosophy, and literature. The empire that once ruled the seas learned again to master the mind and the spirit. If this story changed how you see history, share it with someone who loves exploring the rise and fall of civilizations. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into the empires that shaped our world. Spain's empire was the first to circle the globe, the prototype of modern power. Its rise and fall remind us that empires are never eternal. They burn brightly, they cast long shadows, and eventually they fade, leaving behind lessons written not in gold or glory, but in the lives of those who carry their memory forward.